January 1943. The skies above Germany were clear, almost serene, a momentary calm before the storm. Below, the sprawling fields of the Luftwaffe airfields lay in the quiet of early morning. The hum of aircraft engines was unheard, and yet, the distant sound of something different was coming. Suddenly, like a thunderclap, they appeared, not one, but dozens. High above, they stretched out across the horizon like a dark swarm, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. The unmistakable formation of American B-17 flying fortresses. The Germans had laughed at them before, dismissing these bulky American bombers as nothing more than a nuisance, an easy target for their fighters. But now, as the B-17s descended like hellfire on their airfields, that arrogance would turn to disbelief. The roar of engines grew louder, a deafening noise that cut through the silence. The German officers, once so sure of their superiority, stared up at the planes, their smiles fading as they realized the gravity of what was about to unfold. The B-17s were not just another bomber. They were the beginning of something far more destructive than anyone had anticipated. By 1941, the world was locked in a brutal struggle, and air warfare had already begun to show its decisive power. Across Europe, the Luftwaffe had dominated skies, a formidable force that made rapid strikes and established German superiority early in the war. The Luftwaffe's blitzkrieg tactics had devastated Poland, France, and much of Western Europe, and Germany seemed unstoppable. They had perfected the art of close air support and had revolutionized the way warfare was fought from the skies. Meanwhile, the Allies, particularly the United States, were still in the early stages of their air campaigns. American bombers had yet to be tested in the same way that their German counterparts had. The U.S. military had been largely focused on defensive strategies, particularly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The shift toward more aggressive action would take time, but behind the scenes, American air forces were already planning their strategic role in the European theater. The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, began to realize that daylight precision bombing could be the key to breaking the stalemate. This concept was radical for the time, as the Germans relied heavily on night raids for their bombing campaigns. But the Americans believed they could change the equation. They needed a bomber that could carry large payloads, strike with precision, and defend itself in hostile skies. In response, the Boeing company developed the B-17 Flying Fortress, an aircraft that would become one of the most iconic symbols of World War II. Initially, there were doubts about the bomber's abilities. Early models were slow and prone to damage, but the B-17's strength came from its heavy defensive armament and high-altitude capabilities. It could survive attacks and still reach its targets. It was, as its name suggested, a flying fortress. But the Germans had been dismissive of American aircraft. The Luftwaffe believed that their fighters could easily overpower the B-17s, just as they had done with previous Allied bombers. To them, the B-17 was an overhyped, cumbersome machine that would struggle to make an impact on the battlefield. The B-17 Flying Fortress first entered the skies in 1938, but it wasn't until 1942 that the bomber began to make its mark. By then, the American military had already launched several bombing campaigns over Europe, targeting key industrial sites in Germany, France, and Italy. The B-17s were used in these early operations, though initially with mixed results. The Flying Fortress had a distinct advantage, its heavy armament. It was equipped with up to 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, manned by the crew, which provided an almost constant defensive barrage. This would become a defining feature of the B-17, its ability to withstand enemy fire while protecting its crew. However, these early bombing runs were perilous. The Luftwaffe had strong fighter defenses that would often harry the bombers as they flew their long, treacherous missions. Despite the challenges, the B-17 proved its worth as it participated in the daylight strategic bombing raids across Europe. Its ability to drop bombs with precision at high altitudes made it a useful weapon, but the aircraft's vulnerability was evident. The B-17s were slow, and while they could take a beating, they couldn't withstand constant attack without proper protection. In early 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces began to plan more aggressive raids. They were determined to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany's war machine, its factories, its fuel depots, its transportation hubs. These bombing campaigns would require not just more B-17s, but a complete rethink of air combat strategies. The Germans had underestimated the sheer willpower and ingenuity of the Americans. They had dismissed the B-17 as a flying coffin, an aircraft that would never stand up to the German fighters. However, with each raid, the B-17 proved more resilient than anyone expected. Its ability to hold formation and its heavy defensive firepower began to make a significant difference in the skies over Europe. In the harsh skies above Europe, the B-17 crews were thrust into a world of constant danger. Daylight raids were an unrelenting test of human endurance. Each mission took its toll, physically and mentally, as airmen faced not only the possibility of being shot down, but also the grim reality of seeing their fellow comrades fall from the sky. For the American crews, these missions were personal. Many of them were young men, barely out of their teens, thrust into a conflict they had never imagined. The B-17's crew consisted of 10 men, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, and gunners. Each played a vital role in ensuring the bomber completed its mission. But it was the gunners who faced the most immediate danger. They manned the heavy machine guns, tirelessly firing at enemy fighters that swarmed around them. Despite the B-17's formidable defense, it was not invincible. German fighters, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, would dive in from above, attacking from the rear, or attempting to make precise strikes from the front. The air was thick with the sound of bullets ripping through the sky, tracer rounds arcing towards their targets, and the screams of those who didn't make it out. But for many of the German officers, the B-17 was an enigma. Early reports from the Luftwaffe had dismissed it as little more than a nuisance. But as they saw the bombers press deeper into their territory, they began to reconsider. German officers like Major Erich Hartmann, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, spoke with disdain about Allied bombers. He mocked the American B-17 crews, saying they lacked the aggression of their own pilots. Yet, as the B-17s began to rain destruction down on the Luftwaffe airfields, the reality was impossible to ignore. The precision of the bombers, combined with the overwhelming force of their defensive firepower, was a game-changer. From the perspective of the American crews, the B-17 raids were often more about survival than destruction. Many airmen knew they were entering hostile skies. They understood the dangers, the uncertainty of whether they would return home. But despite the odds, they remained resolute. For them, it was a battle of attrition, a matter of doing their job, day after day, even when the enemy seemed overwhelming. The human cost of these raids was immense, but the resolve of those who flew the B-17s would leave a legacy that would reshape the course of the war. When the B-17s first entered the fray over Europe, their role was clear. They were to target key industrial and military sites to cripple the German war machine. But the effectiveness of these raids was initially questioned. Early bombing runs demonstrated that while the B-17s could strike their targets with remarkable precision, they were vulnerable in a hostile environment. The Luftwaffe, equipped with experienced pilots and swift, well-armed aircraft, easily outmaneuvered the B-17s in the early days of their campaigns. The bomber's large, bulky frame made it an easy target for German fighters. The B-17's slow speed, combined with its limited ability to defend itself against sudden attacks, left it exposed during critical moments. Despite these early challenges, the Americans did not give up on their strategy. Instead, they adapted. They learned from their losses and continually improved the tactics for their bombing runs. One of the most significant tactical changes was the formation flying that became a hallmark of B-17 raids. Rather than flying as individual bombers, the B-17s would fly in tight formations, with as many as 20 or more bombers flying in close proximity to one another. This allowed the bombers to provide mutual defense, covering each other with their machine guns as they crossed the enemy's path. The change in tactics had a profound impact. While the bombers were still vulnerable to concentrated attacks, the large formations of B-17s made it much more difficult for the Luftwaffe to pick them off one by one. The sheer firepower that came from the bombers flying together was enough to force the German fighters to rethink their approach. A single bomber might be an easy target, but a swarm of them, firing back with deadly accuracy, was a different story altogether. As the U.S. Army Air Forces continued to refine their strategy, they began to use more advanced navigation systems and improve their targeting methods. They perfected the use of radar, allowing them to navigate through clouds and strike targets with incredible accuracy. These technological advancements made the B-17 a more formidable weapon, even as it still faced the ever-present threat of enemy interception. It was this evolving tactical approach, combined with the sheer numbers of bombers being sent into the skies, that began to turn the tide in favor of the Allies. The B-17 wasn't just a flying fortress, it was a weapon of attrition, designed to wear down the enemy over time. The German air defense systems were not equipped to deal with such sustained, large-scale attacks, and as the months passed, the effectiveness of the B-17 began to show in the damage it inflicted on the German war effort. The B-17 Flying Fortress was more than just a bomber. It was a marvel of engineering that changed the way aerial combat was fought. It was the culmination of years of design, testing, and innovation, and it represented the apex of American bomber technology during World War II. The aircraft was designed to carry a heavy payload of bombs and return from long-range missions with the resilience to survive multiple hits from enemy fire. One of the most important technological features of the B-17 was its heavy defensive armament. The aircraft was equipped with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, manned by the crew. These guns were strategically placed in the nose, tail, belly, and in each of the wings, creating a veritable wall of fire around the bomber. The sheer amount of firepower that the B-17 could bring to bear made it a terrifying prospect for any enemy fighter. This was one of the key factors that allowed the B-17 to survive longer missions over heavily defended targets. It could engage enemy aircraft at all angles, making it a formidable foe even when surrounded by German fighters. Another critical feature was the B-17's high-altitude capabilities. The bomber was designed to fly at altitudes of up to 30,000 feet, beyond the range of most German fighters. This allowed the B-17s to avoid the worst of the Luftwaffe's attacks, making it a more difficult target for enemy pilots. The B-17's pressurized cabin and thick armor plating also ensured that the crew was protected from the extreme conditions at high altitudes. However, the B-17 wasn't invincible. Its size and speed made it a relatively easy target for skilled German pilots, particularly when the bombers were not flying in tight formations. The aircraft's vulnerability was most pronounced during bombing runs, when the bombers were forced to slow down to drop their payload. At that moment, they became sitting ducks for enemy fighters that could pick them off with ease. But the more the B-17 was used in combat, the more it evolved. By early 1943, the bomber had become a weapon that could be relied upon to carry out the Allies' strategic bombing campaigns with impressive precision. One of the key elements of the B-17's success was the American doctrine of strategic bombing. Unlike the German Luftwaffe, which focused on tactical strikes, the Allies saw the bombing of enemy industry as the way to bring about victory. The B-17 played a vital role in this doctrine. Its ability to strike factories, transportation hubs, and fuel depots with pinpoint accuracy gave the Allies a strategic advantage. While the Germans had underestimated the B-17's potential, they quickly learned that it was capable of inflicting massive damage on their war machine. As the war progressed, the technological improvements to the B-17 only increased its lethality. The introduction of new radar systems and improved targeting technologies meant that the bombers could hit their targets with even more accuracy. The B-17 was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a symbol of American innovation and resilience, a testament to the power of technology in modern warfare. The leadership behind the development of the B-17 was as crucial to its success as the technology itself. The bomber was the product of a vision, one that sought to challenge the status quo of military air combat and shift the balance of power in favor of the Allies. The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, leadership understood early on that air superiority was going to be a key factor in winning the war. The vision of the B-17 was shaped by the belief that strategic bombing, carried out by long-range bombers, could cripple the enemy's ability to wage war. The leadership of General H. Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, played a vital role in pushing for the creation of the B-17 and its continued development. He believed that the United States needed a bomber that could fly long distances, carry a substantial payload, and defend itself against enemy aircraft. His vision was to create a weapon that could strike deep into enemy territory, changing the way the war was fought. While General Arnold's leadership was instrumental, the B-17's development was also driven by the efforts of key individuals at Boeing, led by designer Edward T. Ted Wells. Wells and his team faced numerous challenges in the design process, but they persevered, creating an aircraft that exceeded expectations. Despite early doubts about its potential, the B-17 proved to be a game-changer. On the German side, the leadership had a very different approach. Initially, they underestimated the American bomber effort. Luftwaffe commanders, such as Hermann Göring, dismissed the B-17 as nothing more than a minor nuisance. Göring believed that the Luftwaffe's superiority would easily neutralize any Allied bombers. His dismissal of the American threat would prove costly. As the B-17s began to make their presence felt over Europe, German leadership, led by figures like Göring, was forced to confront the reality that the American bomber fleet was not just a nuisance. It was a serious threat that required a significant shift in strategy. The Luftwaffe scrambled to develop countermeasures, from better fighter tactics to the use of new technologies like radar and night fighters. But it was clear that the B-17's effectiveness was only growing. The American leadership, in contrast, remained resolute. Despite heavy losses early in the campaign, the USAF remained committed to their strategic bombing campaign. They knew that victory in the air would require both the technological advantage of the B-17 and the strategic vision to use it effectively. This perseverance, fueled by strong leadership, would eventually tilt the air war in favor of the Allies. From the German perspective, the B-17 flying fortress was initially regarded with a mix of contempt and indifference. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots, having dominated the skies early in the war, believed that the slow, lumbering American bombers would be no match for their high-speed fighters. To the Germans, the B-17 was just another in a long line of Allied bombers, easily intercepted and shot down before it could cause significant damage. This overconfidence was reinforced by the early engagements with the B-17. The Luftwaffe's top aces, such as Erich Hartmann and Gunther Röhl, boasted of their ability to down any Allied bomber that dared enter German airspace. The American B-17 crews, while well-equipped and well-trained, were still relatively new to the air combat theater. Their aircraft were often slow and lacked the maneuverability of German fighters. To the Germans, it seemed inevitable that these bombers would be picked off one by one. But the B-17's resilience began to challenge that belief. The first real hint that the flying fortress was more than just a nuisance came during the first major bombing raids on German targets in 1942. Despite suffering heavy losses, the B-17s were able to complete their missions, inflicting significant damage to critical infrastructure. German commanders were forced to admit that the B-17 was more formidable than they had anticipated. The psychological shift among German pilots and commanders was palpable. As the bombing raids intensified, the Luftwaffe's tactics began to change. At first, the Germans attempted to engage the bombers with their standard fighter tactics, diving on the bombers from above or attacking from below. But these methods were often thwarted by the B-17's defensive firepower. The sheer volume of bullets raining from the bombers made it increasingly dangerous for the German fighters to approach. By late 1942 and into 1943, German high command recognized that the B-17 was no longer just a minor irritation. It had become a central part of the Allied strategy, and the Luftwaffe's inability to stop it was becoming a serious problem. In response, they scrambled to develop new tactics to deal with the threat. The introduction of fighter escorts like the Bf-110 and the deployment of night fighters were just a few of the measures taken to counter the B-17's effectiveness. However, these strategies, while disruptive, could never fully neutralize the bomber's power. The B-17's role in the Allied air campaign, and the Germans' growing recognition of its threat, marked a turning point in the war. It wasn't just the bombers themselves, but the broader impact they had on the German psyche that made the B-17 such a formidable adversary. The Germans had underestimated the resolve and technological prowess of the Americans, a mistake they would soon regret. It was a cold, clear morning on the 17th of August, 1943. The skies over Europe were already filling with the roar of war, as the Allied air forces assembled for one of the most ambitious raids of the war to date, Operation Overlord, a precision daylight bombing campaign that would strike the heart of Germany's industrial base. The target was the heavily fortified ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, a vital center of German war production. These factories produced the crucial ball bearings needed for the German military's tanks, airplanes, and other machinery. To destroy the supply chain would be a crippling blow to the Nazi war effort. The B-17s were tasked with this pivotal mission, flying deep into enemy territory. For the first time, the American airmen would face the full might of the Luftwaffe's defenses. But they also had something in their favor: improved formation tactics, better weaponry, and the raw will to succeed. The raid would be a test, not only of the B-17's resilience, but of the strategic bombing campaign itself. The B-17s took off in tight formations, their engines roaring as they made their way across the English Channel. They were escorted by a fleet of P-47 Thunderbolts, but the Luftwaffe was prepared. As the bombers neared the target, German fighters, including the formidable Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, descended on them. The first wave of B-17s dropped their bombs over the target, hitting their marks with astonishing precision. But this success came at a high price. As the bombers continued their runs, the Luftwaffe launched a concentrated attack. Waves of German fighters swarmed around the bombers, firing relentlessly. The B-17s fought back with everything they had, machine guns blazing, each plane doing its best to protect itself and its comrades. The battle in the skies became an intense, bloody spectacle. The Germans were relentless, but so were the Americans. The B-17s absorbed hits, losing planes to enemy fire, but many others pressed on, completing their missions with the courage and tenacity that had come to define them. As the bombers finally pulled away from the target, many of them were heavily damaged. Yet the raid had succeeded. The Schweinfurt factories were severely damaged, and the Allies had struck a decisive blow against the German war effort. However, the victory came at a cost. Of the 376 B-17s that took part in the mission, 60 were lost. That was a loss of more than 15% of the attacking force, a devastating blow. The raid showed both the power and vulnerability of the B-17. The German resistance had been far fiercer than anticipated, but it was also clear that the B-17s, despite their losses, had the potential to change the course of the war. The American leadership was now more certain than ever that strategic bombing would be a decisive weapon in the fight against Nazi Germany. This raid marked a significant shift in the dynamics of the air war over Europe. The German air defense network, once confident in its superiority, now faced a new reality. The B-17s were here to stay, and they were capable of striking deep into the heart of Germany, with devastating consequences. The Battle of Schweinfurt had far-reaching consequences. While the raid was a success in terms of its objectives, the staggering losses suffered by the American bombers set the stage for a significant shift in both American and German strategies. For the Germans, the raid underscored the resilience and effectiveness of the B-17. The Luftwaffe commanders, once dismissive of the American bombers, now understood that these aircraft could not simply be dismissed. The raid forced a rethinking of the Luftwaffe's air defense strategy. The German fighters, despite their initial success, could not counter the sheer force and precision of the Allied bombing campaign. The raid demonstrated that the B-17s could withstand attacks and continue their missions, a testament to the bomber's strength and the skill of its crews. In the aftermath, German air forces began to rethink their tactics. The Germans initiated an overhaul of their own bombing defense strategy, shifting focus to better interceptors and implementing new radar systems. But it was already too late. The Americans had learned from their losses, and they would adapt their tactics further. In the coming months, the use of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang would drastically improve the B-17 survivability in future raids, further neutralizing the Luftwaffe's response. The psychological impact on the American crews was profound. Although the raid had cost them dearly, the fact that they had succeeded in their mission despite such heavy losses gave them an unshakable confidence. The Allies had proved that they could strike at the heart of the Third Reich, and no matter how high the price, the B-17 would be there to stay. For the German airmen, the raid had shattered their sense of invulnerability. They had thought the B-17 was just another bomber that would falter under pressure, but they had underestimated its design, the resilience of its crew, and the American determination. The raid was a wake-up call for the Luftwaffe, forcing them to acknowledge that their previous assumptions about the war in the air were no longer valid. The Battle of Schweinfurt was a harbinger of a new phase in the war, one where air superiority would be decided not by the speed and maneuverability of fighters, but by the sheer endurance and firepower of strategic bombers. For the Americans, the B-17 raids marked a decisive step in the Allied strategy of bombing Nazi industrial centers, crippling their ability to wage war. The damage to the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt had a far-reaching effect on the German military, slowing production of essential components for tanks, aircraft, and other military machines. The factories were vital to the Nazi war machine, and their loss would have repercussions that reverberated throughout the rest of the conflict. Yet the cost of the raid was staggering. 60 B-17s were lost, and the heavy casualties were a stark reminder of the price of war. The raid demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most advanced bombers, and the question of whether the losses were worth the strategic gain became a subject of intense debate. Despite the success of the mission, it was clear that the cost in lives and aircraft was too high for a single raid, and a new approach would be necessary to ensure the effectiveness of future bombing campaigns. The American High Command quickly realized that long-range fighter escorts would be essential to protect the B-17s from the increasingly aggressive Luftwaffe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had initially provided limited support, was soon replaced by the P-51 Mustang, a far more capable long-range fighter. The Mustang had the range to escort the bombers all the way to their targets deep within German territory, significantly reducing the vulnerability of the B-17s. By late 1943, the tide was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. The new tactics of tight formations, combined with the Mustang escort, allowed the B-17s to penetrate deeper into enemy territory with fewer losses. The Germans, who had once thought the B-17 a mere nuisance, now found themselves struggling to stop the relentless bombing campaign. The B-17s, along with their fighter escorts, began to systematically dismantle the German war machine from the air. For the Germans, the losses suffered in the wake of the Schweinfurt raid could not be replaced easily. The Luftwaffe had been the pride of the Third Reich, and their inability to prevent these attacks deeply shook German morale. The Nazis, who had initially boasted of their air superiority, were now on the defensive. They were forced to shift their resources toward the defense of the Reich, diverting critical manpower and equipment away from other military fronts. The impact on the Luftwaffe's ability to mount effective offensive operations was significant, with their fighters increasingly tasked with protecting German cities and industrial sites from the B-17s. They could not maintain the same level of aggression against the Allies on other fronts. The Battle of Schweinfurt marked the beginning of a prolonged period of air superiority for the Allies, one that would not only influence the outcome of the war, but reshape the nature of modern aerial combat. The aftermath of the B-17 raids was not only a matter of strategic shifts and tactical changes. It was a profound psychological blow for both the Germans and the Americans. For the American crews, the raid and the subsequent heavy losses only strengthened their resolve. Despite the terrifying risks and the constant threat of death, the crews of the B-17s knew they had a mission to complete. The emotional toll was immense. Many of the airmen had come to see the B-17 as more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of their unity and determination. They knew that, despite the odds, they were capable of striking at the heart of the enemy. The sacrifices of their comrades, and the harsh lessons learned from Schweinfurt would shape their future missions. They would continue to press on, knowing that the B-17 could, and would, carry them through the worst the Luftwaffe could throw at them. For the Germans, the raids represented a wake-up call. Initially, they had treated the American bombers with disdain. They believed their air superiority would easily wipe out the Allied bombers before they could do any serious damage. But the B-17s had shown that they were a force to be reckoned with. This realization led to a psychological shift within the Luftwaffe. The once proud pilots now faced the harsh reality that the war was entering a new phase. The German pilots had long been regarded as the best in the world, but the sustained, large-scale bombing campaigns launched by the Allies forced them into a defensive posture. They could no longer dominate the skies with the ease they once had. This shift in air superiority had a ripple effect on the morale of the German civilian population. The skies above Germany were no longer a place of safety, and the constant threat of Allied bombers, not just in the form of B-17s, but the growing presence of other bombers and fighters, cast a dark shadow over the country. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect their cities and factories contributed to a growing sense of fear and uncertainty within the German population. On the Allied side, the psychological victory was significant. The B-17 had proven itself in combat, not just as a bomber, but as a symbol of American resilience and ingenuity. The raid on Schweinfurt and the subsequent raids proved that the Allies could not only match the Germans in the air, but had the technological and tactical advantage to overcome them. The B-17, with its heavy defensive firepower and ability to strike at the heart of the enemy, represented a key pillar of the Allied war effort. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its distinctive shape and relentless precision, became a symbol not just of American military might, but of the broader technological revolution that defined the 20th century's warfare. The raids on Schweinfurt and subsequent campaigns were not merely about the destruction of enemy infrastructure. They were about the evolution of air combat, a shift in how wars were fought and won from the skies. The B-17's ability to endure heavy damage and still accomplish its mission forever changed the role of bombers in modern warfare. The psychological toll of these bombings was significant on both sides. For the Germans, the realization that they could no longer control their airspace and that their once imposing Luftwaffe was being slowly worn down by a relentless stream of American bombers was a blow to the morale of the entire Third Reich. No longer was it a question of tactical superiority. The Allies had introduced a new form of warfare, a slow, methodical, and overwhelming force that didn't rely on speed but on endurance, technological innovation, and a relentless will to succeed. For the Americans, the B-17 raids, despite their immense cost, represented the ultimate triumph of innovation over adversity. The ability to carry out strategic bombing missions with precision, even in the face of fierce opposition, solidified the B-17's place in history. It wasn't the most nimble aircraft, nor the fastest, but it was a testament to the power of persistence and human ingenuity. The crews who manned these bombers showed extraordinary courage, pushing through fear, loss, and hardship to carry out their mission, time and time again. Looking back, the B-17 raids marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The psychological shift that took place, from overconfidence in German defenses to a new awareness of the resilience of the B-17s, helped shape the future of aerial warfare. The tactical evolution of the Allies, with their focus on tight formations, long-range escorts, and sustained bombing campaigns, laid the groundwork for the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. In the broader scope of history, the B-17 represents more than just an aircraft. It symbolizes the extraordinary sacrifices made by the men who flew it, the technological advancements that drove the war effort, and the immense psychological shifts that occurred on both sides of the conflict. It was a crucial chapter in the Allied victory, showing that technological innovation, when combined with determination and courage, can alter the course of history. The story of the B-17 is a reminder of the complexities of war, the blend of human courage, technological prowess, and the inexorable march of time. And as the dust settled over Europe, it became clear that the skies had irrevocably changed, a transformation that would shape not just the course of World War II, but the future of warfare itself.